We have had times with low, high tax rates and decent amounts of growth, Neil. You know, it's possible. I'm not as pessimistic as you are, just that the absolute size of government's the problem, but it could be. But I want to turn, we've got a few minutes left. I'd like to turn to the non-monetary, non-growth aspects of this. I want to think about, you know, this is called the Human Prosperity Project, our project, but, you know, prosperity isn't just about financial well-being. It's about the meaning and agency and responsibility and dignity that we get from our economic system. Socialists tend to see the capital system as cruel and rapacious. I see it as a form of cooperation that's uncoordinated from the top. Socialists see socialism as a way that we can all share equally. I see it as a way that corruption becomes rampant through decentralization, cronyism and lobbying get rewarded. And for me, although I think socialism will lower perhaps our standard of living, I'm more worried about what it does to the intangible aspects of life. And I'd like you to both comment on that if you'd like, beyond the material. You know, the systems that you've been criticizing in Cuba, Venezuela, the Soviet Union, when these processes go to their extreme, it's not just that the people there are poor. They don't get much consolation in those systems from the fact that everybody's like them. In fact, there are people at the top who are doing great. And more than that, the daily fabric of life is fundamentally corrupted in those countries. So talk about the non-material part of this. And am I being overly worried that the welfare state will turn into such a dramatic change in our way of life beyond just the material? Neil, if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear from the history of the authentically socialist systems that they were characterized not only by ultimately inefficiencies and distortions in economic activity, but just as much by the kind of moral corrosion that you're talking about. And I think if anybody needed reminding of what it was like in the Soviet Union, it was quite worth watching the dramatization of the Chernobyl disaster, which is one of the few television series I've watched in the last 20 years from beginning to end. For all the liberties that it took, it captured the fundamental mendacity of life under real existing socialism. Everybody lied, and ultimately those lies led to a disaster. I'd like to add another point, Russ, before we run out of time, which we haven't touched on, but it's extremely important. And that is the metamorphosis of Marxism in the academy initially into something that had nothing to do with economics whatsoever, or at least barely. The metamorphosis of it into identity politics, critical race theory, bogus notions of social justice, and a whole set of very distinctive ideas that really have nothing to do with socialism, but offer an alternative sense of collectivism based not on class, but predominantly on race, but also on sexual orientation. And the rise in the universities of the United States of ideas like intersectionality has created a whole new set of problems for those of us who believe in the fundamentals of individual liberty, not only liberty economically, but liberty politically and in a civil sense. And I'm almost as troubled as by the resurgence of social democracy and tax and spend progressivism by this, because I think this emphasis on identity, to use a term that you used earlier, of tribal identity or of intersectional identity, is very, very corrosive, not only of individual liberty, but also of national or patriotic identity. You used tribal earlier in that connection, but the point about nationalism was precisely that it transcended traditional tribal loyalties and created a possibility of national unity on a very large scale. That has been crucial to the success of the United States since its foundation. And I think the radical left's new form of socialism, which is the identity politics, cancel culture variant, is just as threatening, actually, as the old socialism we've been mostly talking about.
Yeah, I think very quickly, I think cultural Marxism as a sort of founder, Gramsci, I think the idea was that with the Industrial Revolution and the modern welfare state here in the United States, that you were not going to get socialism with a strictly economic appeal. There was upward mobility and there was a material appetite that was being satisfied. So what's happened is we are redefining victims, not by economic means or class, but by race. And we do that because race is a static idea. It's not fluid. When you have people doing well, then they go from one class to another and you lose constituents. But under this new identity politics, LeBron James may have 20 Mercedes and Jaguars and live in a gated estate and be worth $500 million, or Oprah. But he's a victim, and he said, I don't feel like I can walk out. Well, he's in much less danger of walking out with his security team than a guy in Youngstown, Ohio on a forklift is. So the idea was that the left said to themselves, the system is so insidious of free market capitalism that we're losing constituents. So now we're going to turn to this idea that you're going to be part of the other for life. And Barack Obama, from his Colorama mansion in DC, or his $14 million estate on Martha's Vineyard, will forever be a victim, as Michelle has said. She said that, Michelle Obama said, I can't even go to a supermarket without somebody wanting me to reach and pick up something for her. Or that when Barack walks out, who knows what's going to happen to him. Well, so it was a very brilliant transformation in the status of the victim of capitalism because it's fixed. It can't be changed. So I know that as somebody who spent 22 years in the California State University system, and I served on a lot of hiring committees with affirmative action, finally, to get people in foreign language, we were hiring aristocrats from Chile or Argentina or Brazil or Spain or Portugal, and then we were having them come in. And they were upper middle class, but they qualified as a victimized minority of, United States history of racism. And we instantly bestowed on them the title of victim for life. It was a very cynical process. And that's what's happening. I think it's a very good point, because once you substitute race for class, then that victimization, it creates a cynicism, because people look at certain material foundational principles of one's life and they say, well, based on the person's house or their income, they've done very well, but they're still a victim of our system? And I think that's hard to do, because if we know anything from the 20th century, the slow progress but undeniable progress in the United States, we have divorced particular races from poverty. There's no necessary connection. The per capita income of Greek Americans or Asian Americans is much higher than so-called white Americans. And so I think the left hit on something, and they've redefined Marxism and socialism and victimization and victimizers.
But maybe, can I add a very brief point? We've had 137 questions as we've been talking, and I've been trying to keep an eye on them. And a number of them have prompted me to make the following observation: that the people who believe in a free society, capitalism, if you want to use the pejorative term of free markets, are not indifferent to the poor and not indifferent to the unfortunate. Actually, one of the things that motivates us is the belief that the system that we favor would would in fact do more for the people than the supposedly more just socialist or social democratic alternatives. One reason that I feel quite passionately conservative is a sense that the left is deeply hypocritical and does not sincerely intend to help the people who are at the bottom of the income distribution, and doesn't in fact do practically much for the poorest African Americans in the most deprived parts of the country. It's the hypocrisy of socialism that ultimately is its most disgusting feature. The champagne socialists that I remember first encountering as an undergraduate at Oxford, who loved to stand and engage in virtue signaling, do nothing in practice for the people at the bottom of the social heap whom they never ever meet. In reality, the enterprise of welfare social democracy usually traps people in the bottom quintile of the income distribution in various forms of dependency, ensuring that social mobility is kept out of their reach. And that's an extremely important point for us to emphasize. It's the fact that socialism consistently fails to deliver improvements in the quality of life for the poor, that it fails actually to deliver on its most fundamental claims, that makes it, to me, especially abhorrent as an ideology.
You
Well, I'm going to add, we only have 3 minutes left, but I want to challenge both of you. I'm going to give you each a minute. I don't think our side, the so-called free market side, has done a very good job making that case, Neil, that our system is going to work out better for the poor. They look at the poor today, with especially the working poor. There's a whole group that can't find a job because they got a lousy education provided by a government school. But there are plenty of people who are working poor who their prospects for advancing are not what they may have been in the past. Do you blame that on socialism, or do you think we have to do a better job in creating real capitalism, or do you think that our critics have a point?
I think we've done an extremely poor job, to speak broadly of conservatives, not just in the United States, but around the world, of making the case for free markets and free institutions and individual liberty. I think we got somewhat trapped in the ideas of the 1980s, and we held on to the prescriptions of the 1980s for too long, and then were in some measure hijacked by populists whose approach is not really, I think, entirely in sympathy with the first principles of conservatism. I've been critical of Republicans since the Bush administration for their fiscal improvidence and bouts of hypocrisy. I've been concerned about the ways in which the Republican Party and the British Conservative Party have strayed from the path of classical liberal principles in economics and in politics for many, many years. I wrote The Great Degeneration, lamenting that this was a bipartisan undermining of the first principles of a free society. I think the Hoover Institution has an urgent top priority mission to revive the case for conservatism and free institutions in terms of what they do for the people at the bottom of the heap. Because if we're just seen to be representing the wealthy elite, then we'll have no chance whatever of winning the argument, which we can win against socialism.
And we don't deserve to win it. I hope. Right. I'm sure Condi Rice is listening, and
Could I have time to say 10 seconds?
Yeah, absolutely. You got 60 seconds, Victor, maybe 75. Go ahead.
Well, I think in a way that the opiate of the elite left is socialism, because it's a psychological process. It's very similar to medieval penance and exemption, the idea that a sinner can be free of sins through a contract to build a church or something. And by that, I mean that if you look at the concrete life of many of the elite left, where they put their children, whether they have a wall around their home or not, whether they believe in charter schools, they don't. They live the life of a European aristocrat of the 19th century or American aristocrat. And so they create this such structure that they're caring and they want to be with the other and they want to help the other through government socialist programs. But it sort of squares the circle of their own existence. And so if they really worried about the other, maybe they would have their children tutor in East Palo Alto, or maybe they put their kids in a Redwood City school so the other could see them, or maybe they would have a private mentorship with somebody of the underclass, or maybe they would try to, instead of give to, the Sierra Club, they would try to help build a church in Fresno or something. But it's always abstract, and it's geared to make people feel better. And it's almost a religious experience for many people who are secular or agnostic. And I think this drives the progressive movement today, that all of these tech barons and all the really wealth in the country today, if you look at the Fortune 500, it's pretty much left-wing fortunes. And they're people who they never live in their own lives in any way similar to the advocacy. In fact, they use it to be exempt from the ramifications of their own ideology. And that they use that is this caring and this abstract socialism that really makes life more miserable for the people who they say they want to help, but it makes them feel far better of dealing with the problem, as I said, in the abstract rather than the concrete.
Well, we'll close on that cheerful note.